I stood frozen in my parents' living room, the scent of lemon polish choking the air, as my mother, Evelyn, handed me a battered vacuum cleaner, its cord frayed like a noose. "This suits you better, Claire," she said, her voice honeyed, but sharp, her manicured nails catching the chandelier's light. "I'm Claire Harper, a 35-year-old librarian," and in that moment, I felt my entire existence reduced to a single, cruel gesture. Across the room, my brother Ethan, 2 years my senior, dangled a set of house keys, his grin as smug as the polished leather sofa he lounged on. A house. They'd given him a house. Not just any house, the sprawling colonial on Maple Street, worth a fortune, handed over like it was nothing. And me? This dented, second-hand machine, presented as if it were a crown. The room seemed to shrink, the walls pressing in as their words echoed. Earlier that evening, at the dining table, Ethan had leaned back, fork in hand, and said, "Claire's so good at keeping things tidy. She doesn't need a house to shine, does she?" His tone was light, but his eyes held a glint of malice. My parents had laughed, a rehearsed harmony, as if my life's work, organizing their chaos, balancing their books, fixing their mistakes, could be summed up in a joke. I'd sat there, my untouched plate growing cold, the weight of 35 years as the reliable one crushing my chest. Reliable, yes. But also invisible. Disposable. The kind of daughter you call when the IRS comes knocking, but not when it's time to divide the family's wealth. It wasn't just the vacuum that cut deep. After dinner, my mother had slid an envelope across the table, her smile unwavering, as if she were offering me a gift. "Your inheritance," she said, her voice a practiced lilt. Inside was a single sheet of paper, a legal document transferring my share of the Harper family trust, the one I'd been promised since I was a girl, to Ethan. "For the house," she explained, as if it were obvious. "He's starting a family, Claire. You understand." My father, Richard, didn't look up from his phone, just muttered, "You're practical. You don't need all that." The word stung, but the final line on the page seared itself into my mind. Claire Elizabeth Harper hereby relinquishes all claims to the Harper Family Trust, effective immediately. My signature stared back at me, written in Evelyn's precise cursive. Forged. I hadn't signed a thing. I gripped the vacuum's handle, my knuckles white, my eyes locked on Ethan's keys. The betrayal wasn't just in the gift or the document, it was in the way they'd orchestrated it, the way they'd rewritten my place in this family. I wanted to scream, to shatter their perfect chandelier, to demand why. But I didn't. I smiled, a tight, controlled curve of my lips, and said, "Thank you, Mom. Dad. Ethan." My voice was steady, but inside, something shifted. Not rage, not yet. It was colder, sharper, a resolve forming like ice in my veins. They thought they could erase me, reduce me to a servant in their story. They were wrong. As I turned to leave, the vacuum's cord snagged on a loose nail in the hardwood floor. It tugged free, revealing a small, folded piece of paper tucked beneath the baseboard. Yellowed, brittle, with my father's unmistakable scrawl. I didn't pick it up, not with their eyes on me. But I saw enough, a date, 10 years old, a dollar amount, $50,000, and my name, not the forged version. It wasn't an accident. It was a crack in their facade, a thread I could pull. My heart pounded, but my face stayed calm, almost serene. They didn't notice my pause, didn't see the shift in my gaze. That was their first mistake. The second came as I reached the door. My mother, ever the performer, called after me, "Claire, dear, don't be upset. We're just looking out for you." Her tone was warm, maternal, the kind she used to charm neighbors. But I caught the flicker in her eyes, a nervousness, a calculation. She wasn't comforting me, she was testing me, gauging whether I'd fight back. I turned, meeting her gaze, and said, "I'm not upset, Mom. I'm grateful." The lie was deliberate, my voice smooth as glass. Her smile faltered, just for a second, and I saw it, fear. Not of me, not yet, but of what I might know. What I might do outside, in the cool night air. I loaded the vacuum into my car, its weight a reminder of their insult. But as I drove to my small apartment, my mind was already working, piecing together the fragments. The forged signature wasn't just a theft, it was a cover-up. The paper under the baseboard wasn't a coincidence, it was evidence of something older, deeper. My parents hadn't just given Ethan a house, they'd built a system to erase me, to protect their golden child and their perfect image. But systems have flaws, and I was a librarian. I knew how to find them, how to connect dots others overlooked. I thought back to a moment years ago, when I was 20, balancing their checkbook while Ethan crashed another car. My father had patted my shoulder, saying, "You're the steady one, Claire." At the time, it felt like praise. Now, it felt like a sentence. They'd relied on me to stay small, to clean up their messes, to never question my place. But that paper, that forged signature, that house, they'd miscalculated. They thought I'd bend. They didn't know I'd break their world instead. I pulled into my parking lot, my phone buzzed. A text from Ethan, "Don't make this hard, Claire. Just let it go." I stared at the screen, my thumb hovering over the reply button. Let it go? No. I wouldn't. But I wouldn't respond either, not yet. I'd learned something in my years of organizing archives: the smallest detail can unravel the biggest lie. That paper under the baseboard was my first clue, and my mother's nervous glance was my second. There was more to this, a deeper betrayal. And I'd find it. Not with screams or tears, but with precision. With proof. With a plan. I carried the vacuum inside, its dented frame a mockery of their gift. But as I set it down, I felt a strange calm. They'd handed me an insult, but they'd also handed me a weapon. Not the vacuum itself, but what it represented. Their arrogance, their belief that I was nothing. I'd use that against them. I'd sweep their lies clean, piece by piece, until their perfect world was dust. The hum of my car's engine couldn't drown out the echo of my mother's words. As I drove back to my one-bedroom apartment, the vacuum cleaner rattling in the trunk like a mocking passenger. I'm Claire Harper, a 35-year-old librarian, trained to piece together stories from fragments, but the story of my own life felt like a book with pages torn out. The weight of that forged signature, the glint of Ethan's house keys, and the yellowed paper under the baseboard clung to me, sharp as broken glass. I wasn't just angry, I was awake, my mind slicing through years of half-truths and calculated slights. They'd built a world where I was the shadow, the one who cleaned up their messes while they crowned my brother the heir. But shadows see everything, and I was starting to notice the cracks. My apartment was small, the kind of place you'd expect for someone who spent her days organizing archives rather than chasing dreams. I set the vacuum by the door, its dented frame a silent accusation, and went straight for the shoebox under my bed. Inside was a locked diary, its leather cover worn but intact, given to me by Aunt Margaret when I was 12. She'd been my father's sister, a quiet woman with sharp eyes who'd lived with us briefly before vanishing after a hushed argument with him. "Keep your own story, Claire," she'd whispered, pressing the diary and its tiny key into my hands. I'd never opened it, afraid of what it might reveal about a family that always felt like a puzzle with missing pieces. Now, with the sting of betrayal fresh, I turned the key, the lock clicking open with a rusty groan. The pages were filled with Margaret's tight handwriting, a ledger of sorts, detailing family finances from 20 years ago. One entry stopped me cold. Richard took $50,000 from the trust for Ethan's future. Claire's share untouched, for now. For now. The phrase sent a chill down my spine. The amount matched the figure on the paper I'd seen under the baseboard, dated 10 years later. This wasn't a coincidence, it was a plan, one that started long before the house, the vacuum, or the forged signature. My father, the man who barely spoke, who hid behind his phone, wasn't just complicit. He'd been orchestrating this for decades, siphoning my future to prop up Ethan's failures. I leaned back against the wall, the diary open on my lap, memories flooding in. I was 16 when I first noticed the pattern. Ethan, always the golden child, crashed his second car, a shiny convertible my parents had bought him. I was the one who handled the insurance calls, negotiating with agents while he sulked. At 20, I worked 2 jobs to pay for college, while my parents funded Ethan's business ventures, a string of failed schemes, from a car wash to a tech startup, all collapsing under his carelessness. They called it investing in his potential. I called it enabling. Once, when I was 22, he borrowed $5,000 from my savings for a sure-thing investment. He never paid me back, and when I brought it up, my mother waved it off. "Family helps family, Claire," she'd said, her tone implying I was selfish for asking. But it was a conversation at 18 that cut deepest. My mother had sat me down in the kitchen, her hands folded neatly, her smile practiced. "You're the backbone of this family, Claire," she'd said. "Ethan's the dreamer, but you're the one we rely on." I'd taken it as praise, a rare moment of warmth. Now, I saw it for what it was, a leash. They relied on me to stay small, to fix their mistakes, to never demand my share. They'd built a system where Ethan was the star, and I was the stagehand, invisible but essential. The diary, though, was a key, a piece of their puzzle they hadn't meant for me to find. I closed it, my hand steady but my mind racing. There was more to Margaret's story. She'd left after that argument with my father, but I remembered her watching me, her eyes searching, as if she saw something no one else did. The next morning, she was gone, her room cleared out, her name rarely mentioned again. I'd overheard my parents once, years later, calling her unstable, a convenient label to dismiss her. But the diary told a different story. She'd seen their game, maybe even tried to stop it, and they'd pushed her out to keep her quiet. I stood, pacing the small room, the vacuum still mocking me from the corner. My librarian's instincts kicked in: connect the dots, follow the trail. I pulled out my laptop and logged into the library's database, searching for anything tied to the Harper Family Trust. Most of it was locked behind private records. But a public notice caught my eye: a property transfer, dated a year before Margaret's departure, moving a small parcel of land from the trust to an unknown buyer. The signature was my father's, but the notary was someone I didn't recognize. Odd. Notaries in our town were few, and I knew most of them from my work. It was a small detail, but it felt wrong, like a book shelved in the wrong section. Then came the second shock. Tucked in the back of the diary was a photograph, creased and faded, of me and Margaret at a family picnic. On the back, in her handwriting, was a note: Claire, you're stronger than they know. Trust yourself. It wasn't just sentiment, it was a warning. She'd known something, seen something, and left me this clue. The photograph wasn't just a memory, it was a message, one I'd ignored for years. My parents hadn't just erased my inheritance, they'd erased her, too, and I was starting to understand why. I set the photo down, my resolve hardening. They thought I'd stay quiet, sweep their floors, accept their insults. But the diary, the paper under the baseboard, the mismatched notary, they were threads in a tapestry of lies, and I was unraveling it. I didn't need to scream or confront them yet. I needed evidence, something concrete to expose their system. My phone buzzed, a text from Ethan: You okay, sis? Don't take it personally. I stared at the words, my lips curling into a cold smile. He was checking on me, testing if I'd push back. I typed a reply: I'm fine, Ethan. Thanks for checking. And hit send. Let him think I was still the obedient sister. Let them all think I was still invisible. As I closed my laptop, I caught my reflection in the window. My eyes were sharp, focused, not the defeated gaze they'd expected. I'd been their backbone, their fixer, their shadow. But shadows move when the light shifts, and I was ready to step into it. The diary was my first weapon, Margaret's words my first ally. They'd underestimated me, and that was their fatal mistake. I didn't know the full scope of their betrayal yet, but I knew enough. This wasn't just about a house or a trust. It was about a family that had built its legacy on my silence, and I was done being quiet. The text from my mother arrived like a court summons, sharp and cold: family meeting, noon. Don't be late. I stood in my apartment, the weight of Aunt Margaret's diary still heavy on my desk, its pages mapping out a betrayal that stretched back decades. The vacuum cleaner, that cruel mockery from my parents, sat in the corner, its frayed cord a silent accusation. The yellowed paper I'd glimpsed under their baseboard, marked with my father's scrawl and a $50,000 figure, haunted me, its echo. In Margaret's words, Claire's share untouched, for now, proof of a plan older than the house they'd given Ethan. Today, I knew, was no ordinary meeting. It was their next move to erase me, and I was ready to watch their game unfold. I stepped into their house on Maple Street, now Ethan's domain, its white columns gleaming like a shrine to my exclusion. The dining room was a stage, the mahogany table polished to a mirror sheen, my parents seated at its head like judges. My brother lounged beside them, his usual smirk replaced by a restless energy, his fingers drumming a nervous rhythm. Laura, his wife, hovered near the doorway, her diamond ring flashing with every anxious gesture. The woman who raised me, Evelyn, wore a smile as tight as her perfectly pressed blouse, the kind she used to charm the town's elite. Sit, Claire, she said, gesturing to a chair at the table's far end, as if I were a stranger in this house I'd once called home. We're finalizing the estate, my father announced, his voice flat, his phone absent for once, his eyes fixed on a stack of papers before him. Ethan's taking over the family business. The words hit like a stone sinking in my chest. The business, a real estate firm inherited from my grandfather, was worth millions, its records a tangle I'd spent years unraveling, chasing missing receipts, filing taxes while my brother barely showed up. Now, it was his. She slid a document across the table, her nails clicking against the wood. We need your signature, Claire. A formality, to transfer control to Ethan. I scanned the pages, my librarian's eye catching every detail, a power of attorney, granting him authority over the business and, by extension, the trust. My trust. The one they'd already stripped from me with a forged signature. I didn't reach for the pen. I need time to review this, I said, my voice steady, though my pulse thundered. His eyes narrowed, his fingers stilling. What's to review? He snapped, sharper than I expected. It's straightforward. You're not cut out for this, Claire. The jab was meant to wound, to remind me of my place, but it was Laura who caught me off guard. She stepped forward, her voice soft, almost pitying. You don't want this burden, Claire. Ethan has a vision for the future. Her words dripped with kindness, but her glance toward my brother betrayed something else, guilt, or perhaps calculation. I'd thought her a bystander, swept up in his schemes. Now, I saw her as a player. The first shock came as I turned the document's second page. The trust's amendment was dated 6 months ago, but the notary stamp bore last week's date. A mistake, or a deliberate slip? My mind raced, connecting it to the paper under the baseboard, the diary's entries. This wasn't just about the business, it was about rewriting my entire inheritance. I looked up, meeting my mother's gaze. "This date doesn't add up," I said, tapping the stamp. Her smile froze, just for a heartbeat, before she recovered. "A clerical error," she said, too quickly. "We'll fix it." But my father's silence was louder, his hands clenching the table's edge. Then came the second blow. Laura, still playing the peacemaker, pulled out a letter, its edges crisp, as if freshly printed. "You wrote this, Claire," she said, her voice trembling with feigned concern. "You agreed Ethan should have the business." The letter, in a handwriting eerily close to mine, begged my parents to give him control, claiming I was overwhelmed and unsuited. My stomach twisted. It was a forgery, bolder than the one on the trust document. I traced the ink, noticing a smudge where the pen had hesitated, a flaw my precise hand would never make. "I didn't write this," I said, my tone ice cold. Laura's face crumpled, but not before I caught the glance she shot Ethan, a signal. Not a plea. The room grew heavy, the air thick with their collective unease. My father finally spoke, his voice low. "Claire, don't make this difficult. You've always been practical. Let Ethan handle this." His words were a command, but his eyes betrayed a flicker of doubt. I leaned back, folding my hands, and said, "I'm just asking for clarity, Dad. If I wrote that letter, why don't I remember it?" The question hung, unanswered, as Ethan shifted, his chair creaking. Laura jumped in, her voice rising. "You're confused, Claire. You've been stressed. We're trying to help you." "Help me?" The lie was so blatant it almost made me laugh. The third shock came from an unexpected source. As I gathered my things to leave, refusing to sign, I noticed a small key on the table, half hidden under a napkin. It was old, tarnished, with a tag bearing my grandfather's initials. I recognized it instantly. It matched the one Margaret had given me with her diary. My parents hadn't noticed it, too busy exchanging glances, but I saw Ethan's hand twitch toward it, then stop. That key wasn't supposed to be there. It was a relic from the trust's original records, kept in a safe I'd organized years ago. Its presence meant someone had been digging, and not for innocent reasons. I didn't touch it. Instead, I stood, my voice calm but deliberate. "I'll think about the document. I'll let you know." My mother's smile returned, too bright, as she said, "Good girl, Claire. Don't overthink it." But her eyes followed me to the door, sharp with worry. Ethan's jaw tightened, and Laura's hands twisted in her lap. They thought they'd cornered me, painted me as the ungrateful daughter, the one who didn't belong. But that forged letter, that mismatched notary, that key, they were cracks in their plan, and I was already prying them open. As I drove away, the key's image burned in my mind. It wasn't just a relic, it was a clue, tied to the trust, to Margaret, to the $50,000 my father had taken. Laura's involvement was clearer now, not just as Ethan's shadow but as an active player, perhaps even the one who'd forged the letter. And my parents, so quick to dismiss the notary's date, were hiding more than I'd thought. This meeting wasn't about the business, it was about burying me deeper, ensuring I'd never claim what was mine. But they'd miscalculated. I wasn't the obedient daughter they'd molded. I was the librarian who knew how to find the truth. And I was just getting started. The days following the family meeting settled over me like a fog, thick and disorienting, each moment laced with subtle jabs meant to wear me down. My refusal to sign their document had shifted something in the air, a quiet tension that followed me from my apartment to the library where I worked. The forged letter, the mismatched notary stamp, and that tarnished key with my grandfather's initials lingered in my mind, each a piece of a puzzle I was determined to solve. My family thought they could bury me under their expectations, but they didn't know I was already digging through their lies. It started with the phone calls. My mother's voice, smooth as polished glass, filled my voicemail daily. "Claire, you're overthinking this," she said in one, her tone a blend of concern and condescension. "Just sign the papers and let's move on. It's for the family." The word family stung, a reminder of the role they'd assigned me, the dutiful daughter who cleaned up their messes but never claimed her share. My brother sent texts, casual but pointed, like darts aimed at my resolve. "Don't stress. Mom out, Claire," one read, as if I were the one causing trouble. I didn't respond, but each message tightened the knot in my chest, a pressure that wasn't loud or violent but suffocating, like a hand closing slowly around my throat. The library, where I spent my days organizing archives, I found a note slipped under my office door. The paper was plain, the words scrawled in a looping script I recognized from Laura's wedding thank you cards: "Stay in your lane, Claire." No signature, but the threat was clear. She wasn't just Ethan's shadow, she was a player in their game, her soft-spoken act a mask for something sharper. I folded the note carefully, tucking it into my bag. It wasn't just a warning, it was evidence, another thread in the tapestry of their deceit. I kept my face neutral, my hands steady. But inside, my resolve burned brighter. They wanted me to feel small, to doubt myself. Instead, they were giving me weapons. The pressure peaked at a family dinner held at a local restaurant, a public stage where my parents played their roles to perfection. The place was packed with neighbors and family friends, the kind of crowd that admired the Harper's polished image. My father raised a glass, his voice booming as he toasted Ethan's new chapter as head of the family business. The table erupted in applause, glasses clinking, while I sat at the far end, my plate untouched, my presence barely acknowledged. Evelyn leaned close, her perfume sharp, and whispered, "Don't embarrass us, Claire. You're not the victim here." Her words were a blade, slicing through the facade of warmth, but it was Ethan who twisted it. "Claire's always been so independent," he said loudly, his smile wide for the crowd. "She doesn't need what we have." The guests nodded, their murmurs of agreement painting me as the ungrateful daughter, the one who didn't fit. I kept my expression calm, my hands folded in my lap, but my eyes scanned the room, catching every glance, every shift in posture. Laura sat across from me, her smile faltering when our gazes met. She busied herself with her napkin, but I saw the tremble in her fingers. She wasn't as confident as she wanted to appear. My father, usually glued to his phone, watched me too, his stare heavy with something I couldn't yet name, guilt, perhaps, or fear. The dinner was their performance, a carefully staged act to cement Ethan's place and erase mine, but it was also a mistake. Public displays left traces, and I was trained to find them. The first shock came as I excused myself to the restroom. In the trash bin, half hidden under a paper towel, was a crumpled receipt, the ink smudged but legible. It was for a storage unit, paid with Ethan's credit card, dated 2 days ago. The address was local, a place I didn't know he used. I slipped it into my pocket, my heart steady but quickening. A storage unit meant secrets, things he didn't want in the house on Maple Street. It was a small detail, but in my world of archives and records, small details were the keys to locked doors. I returned to the table, my face a mask of indifference, but my mind was already mapping out my next move. The second shock came later that night, as I lingered by the restaurant's coat rack, pretending to adjust my scarf. I overheard Ethan talking to Tom, a local realtor, and his old friend, their voices low but clear. "The deal kept the family's name clean," Tom said, his tone uneasy. "You sure it's airtight?" Ethan's reply was sharp, almost desperate. "It has to be." Claire's sniffing around. He cut off when he saw me, his smile snapping back into place, but Tom's face paled. The deal wasn't just about the business or the house, it was something deeper, tied to the trust, to the $50,000 my father had taken, to the key I'd seen. They were covering tracks, and I was getting too close. The third revelation hit as I drove home, the receipt burning a hole in my pocket. I remembered a moment from years ago, when I was 20, helping my mother sort through old files in the family office. She'd handed me a box of papers, her hands shaking slightly, and said, "Burn these, Claire. They're just clutter." I'd hesitated, my instinct to preserve records kicking in, but she'd insisted, watching me until I took the box to the backyard incinerator. One paper had fallen out, unnoticed by her, a bank statement with a handwritten note in my father's scrawl, "For ease debts." I'd thought it was a mistake, a relic of Ethan's failed ventures. Now, I realized it was deliberate, a piece of their plan to siphon my share. She hadn't wanted me to burn the papers to declutter, she'd wanted to destroy evidence. That act, dressed as a simple chore, was a calculated move to keep me ignorant. The pressure was suffocating, their words and actions a tightening noose, but it was also clarifying. Every call, every note, every whispered jab was a piece of their puzzle falling into place. They weren't just greedy, they were desperate, and desperation meant mistakes. I didn't confront them at the dinner, didn't let my anger show. Instead, I smiled, nodded, played the role they'd written for me. But as I left the restaurant, my phone buzzed again. Another text from Ethan: "You looked out of place tonight. Let's talk, sis." I stared at the screen, my lips curving into a cold smile. He wasn't checking on me, he was testing me. Probing for weakness. I typed back, "Sure, Ethan. Whenever you're ready." The words were simple, but they were a trap. Let him think I was still the compliant sister. Let them all think I was still their shadow back in my apartment. I spread the receipt, the note from Laura, and Margaret's diary on my desk. The storage unit was my next lead, a door to whatever Ethan was hiding. The overheard conversation. Confirmed it wasn't just about the house or the business, it was about protecting their lies, keeping their perfect image intact. And my mother's order to burn those papers years ago wasn't a casual request, it was a cover-up, one I'd unknowingly helped execute. The realization burned, but it also sharpened my focus. They thought they could break me with their silent pressure, their public charade. They were wrong. I was a librarian, trained to find the truth in fragments, and I was building my case, piece by piece, ready to turn their game against them. If you're hooked on this story of betrayal and revenge, subscribe to our channel for more gripping family dramas that expose the truth behind perfect facades. The dawn was gray and heavy as I drove to the storage unit listed on the crumpled receipt I'd found in the restaurant trash. The weight of my family's lies pressed against me, each piece of evidence, Margaret's diary, the forged letter, the mismatched notary stamp, the tarnished key, sharp in my mind like shards of broken glass. I'd been their shadow, the one who fixed their messes, but now I was stepping into the light, my resolve cold and unyielding. The storage unit, registered under Laura's maiden name, was my next move, a door to whatever my brother was hiding. They thought they could suffocate me with their whispers and threats, but every jab only sharpened my focus. The facility was on the edge of town, a squat concrete building surrounded by a chain-link fence, its silence broken only by the hum of distant traffic. I used the access code from the receipt, my hand steady as the gate creaked open. Unit 17 was small, its metal door rusted at the edges, but the lock was new, gleaming with purpose. Inside, boxes were stacked haphazardly, papers spilling out like secrets too heavy to contain. I knelt, my librarian's instincts guiding me, and found what I dreaded yet expected: bank statements, property deeds, and a ledger in my father's tight scrawl. One entry stopped me cold: a transfer of $200,000 from the Harper Family Trust to an unfamiliar account, dated a year before the house was gifted to Ethan. The memo read, E. Harper debt repayment. Not my debt. Never my debt. It was Ethan's, and they'd used my share to cover it. I photographed every page, my hands moving with precision, though my heart pounded with the weight of betrayal. This wasn't just about the house or the business, it was a theft, deliberate and calculated, stretching back years. The ledger was a map of their greed, each entry a step in their plan to erase me. But it was also a weapon, and I was no longer the compliant daughter they'd molded. I slipped a single page into my bag, a bank statement with my father's signature, and left the unit as I'd found it, the door clicking shut behind me. They wouldn't know I'd been there. Not yet. Back in my apartment, I spread the evidence on my desk, the ledger's pages alongside Margaret's diary and Laura's threatening note. My phone buzzed, my mother's name flashing on the screen. I let it go to voicemail, her voice syrupy through the speaker. Claire, we're worried about you. Come to dinner tonight. Let's talk. The invitation was a trap, another attempt to pull me back into their script. I didn't respond. Instead, I drove to their house on Maple Street, uninvited, the ledger's page tucked in my coat pocket. This wasn't a confrontation, not yet. It was a test, a chance to see how deep their lies ran. They were in the dining room, the chandelier casting sharp shadows across the table. Ethan sat with Laura, their heads bent together, whispering until I stepped inside. My mother's smile was instant, too bright, as she rose to greet me. Claire, what a surprise, she said, her voice a practiced lilt. My father looked up, his eyes narrowing, while my brother's hand tightened around his glass. Laura's gaze darted to the floor, her fingers twisting her ring. I didn't sit. I stood at the table's edge, my voice calm but deliberate. I found something, I said, pulling the bank statement from my pocket and laying it flat. This says, you took $200,000 from the trust to pay Ethan's debts. My share. The room went still, the air thick with their silence. My mother recovered first, her laugh sharp and brittle. You're misunderstanding, Claire. That was for Ethan's business. You know how hard he's worked. Her words were a performance, but her hands betrayed her, clenching the edge of the table. Ethan leaned forward, his voice low. You're snooping now? That's low, even for you. His anger was real, but there was something else, fear, raw and unmasked. My father slammed his hand on the table, the sound sharp enough to make Laura flinch. Enough, he said. You're not entitled to everything, Claire. Stop digging. The first shock came when I didn't back down. I held their gazes, one by one, and said, you forged my signature to take my share. This proves it. I tapped the statement, my finger lingering on my father's scrawl. Their reactions were a study in guilt. My mother's smile froze, Ethan's jaw tightened, and Laura's eyes widened, her breath catching. But it was my father's silence that cut deepest. He didn't deny it, didn't defend himself. He just stared, his face a mask of calculation. The second shock came from Ethan. He stood, pulling a folded letter from his pocket, his hands shaking slightly. You wrote this, Claire, he said, his voice steady but strained. You begged me to take your share for my future. The letter was a near-perfect imitation of my handwriting, claiming I'd willingly given up the trust to help him. My stomach twisted, not with surprise but with clarity. It was another forgery, sloppier than the first, the ink smudged where the pen had faltered. I didn't write this, I said, my tone ice cold. And you know it. I turned to Laura, whose face had gone pale. Did you help him with this one too? Her gasp was theatrical, her eyes brimming with tears. I was protecting the family, she stammered, but her glance at Ethan betrayed her. She wasn't just complicit, she was the forger. The third shock was the deepest. As I stepped back, ready to leave, my mother reached out, her hand brushing mine. Claire, please, she said, her voice soft, almost pleading. We did this for you. You're too fragile for this responsibility. Fragile. The word was a blade, dressed as kindness, meant to make me doubt myself. But I saw through it, saw the desperation in her eyes. This wasn't about protecting me, it was about protecting their lie. I pulled my hand away, my voice steady. I'm not fragile, Mom. And I'm not done. I walked out, the weight of their stares heavy on my back, but my steps were sure. I in my car, I replayed the moment, their reactions etched in my mind. The ledger was my proof, but the forged letter was their mistake, a crack in their facade I could widen. Laura's role was clearer now, not just Ethan's accomplice, but a schemer in her own right, her tears a performance to mask her ambition. My mother's plea, that false kindness, was another layer of manipulation, but it was my father's silence that lingered. He wasn't just the quiet patriarch, he was the architect, the one who'd orchestrated this theft from the start. I didn't have all the pieces yet, but I had enough to know this wasn't just about money. It was about control, about keeping me small to preserve their perfect image. As I drove home, my phone buzzed again, a text from Tom, the realtor I'd overheard at the restaurant. Meet me tomorrow. I'll tell you about the deal. I stared at the screen, my lips curving into a cold smile. Tom wasn't my ally, but he was a weak link, rattled by my questions at the dinner. I typed back, name the place. Let them think they'd silenced me. Let them believe I was still there. Shadow. I was building a case, piece by piece, and their lies were crumbling faster than they knew. The morning air was sharp as I met Tom, the realtor, at a diner on the outskirts of town, its neon sign flickering like a warning. The ledger from the storage unit, Laura's threatening note, and the forged letter weighed heavy in my bag, each a piece of the puzzle my family had built to erase me. Their lies, the $200,000 siphoned from my share, the forged signatures, the tarnished key, were a noose they'd tightened for years, but I was cutting through it, thread by thread. Tom's text last night, offering to talk about the deal, was a crack in their armor, and I was here to pry it open. My heart was steady, my resolve colder than the coffee cooling in my cup. Tom slid into the booth, his eyes darting to the door, his usual confidence replaced by a nervous twitch. You're stirring things up, Claire, he said, his voice low. Ethan's deal wasn't just about the house. It was about keeping his debts quiet. He slid a folded paper across the table, his hands unsteady. It was a contract, dated 2 years ago, transferring a commercial property from the Harper Family Trust to a shell company. The signature was my father's, but the beneficiary was Ethan, and the notary, once again, didn't match local records. Your parents didn't want the town knowing Ethan's ventures tanked, Tom muttered. They used your share to cover it. The words burned, but I kept my face blank, my fingers tracing the paper's edge. This was proof, not just of theft, but of a deliberate campaign to protect their golden child at my expense. I thanked Tom, my voice calm, and left the diner, the contract tucked safely in my bag. But as I stepped into the parking lot, a familiar figure leaned against my car, Daniel Harper, my cousin, his weathered face half hidden under a baseball cap. I hadn't seen him in years, not since he'd left town after a falling out with my father. Heard you're digging, he said, his voice gruff but warm. Margaret warned me this day would come. My breath caught. Margaret. Her diary. Her key, her cryptic note, they weren't just relics. They were breadcrumbs, leading me to him. She saw what Richard was doing, he continued, glancing over his shoulder. Taking from you to prop up Ethan. She tried to stop him, and they pushed her out. The first shock hit. Daniel wasn't just a distant relative, he was a witness, someone who'd seen their game from the inside. He handed me a small envelope, its edges worn but sealed. Inside was a letter from Margaret, dated a month before she left. Claire, it read, your father's hiding accounts. Check the bank on 3rd Street. Trust Daniel. My pulse quickened, but I kept my expression neutral, tucking the letter away. Daniel's eyes softened. She wanted you to have this fight, he said. I'll help you, but you need someone who knows the law. He gave me a name, Susan. Reed, a lawyer in town, known for taking on messy family disputes. I nodded, my mind already mapping the next step. Daniel wasn't just an ally. He was a bridge to the truth Margaret had left behind. I met Susan that afternoon in her office, a cramped room lined with legal books and the faint scent of old coffee. She was 50, her gray hair pulled back, her eyes sharp as she listened. To my story, the vacuum, the forged signatures, the ledger, the contract. I laid out the evidence, my voice steady, though the weight of betrayal pressed against my ribs. "They've been stealing from you for years," she said, scanning the papers. "This ledger, this contract, they're enough to start a case. But we need more to prove intent." She paused, her gaze locking onto mine. "Your father's clever. He's hidden assets before. But there's a bank account, offshore, tied to the trust. If we can trace it, we've got them." The second shock landed. My father wasn't just the quiet architect. He'd built a secret financial empire, one that left me with nothing. Susan's words were a lifeline, but they also deepened the wound. Every memory of my father's silence, his distracted glances, took on new meaning. He wasn't passive, he was calculating, orchestrating this theft while my mother played the perfect matriarch. I thought of Ethan, his smug grin as he dangled the house keys, and Laura, her forged letter a clumsy attempt to keep me in line. They were all complicit, but my father was the puppeteer. I leaned back, my hands folded, and asked Susan, "What's the first step?" She smiled, a glint of respect in her eyes. "We request records from the bank on 3rd Street. Discreetly. They won't see you coming." That night, I sat in my apartment, the envelope from Daniel open on my desk. Margaret's letter was a whisper from the past, her words a call to arms. But it was the third shock that shook me deepest. Tucked inside the envelope was a photograph, not of Margaret, but of me as a child, sitting on my grandfather's lap. On the back, in his shaky handwriting, was a note, "Claire's trust, untouchable. Protect her." My grandfather, the man who'd built the family's wealth, hadn't intended for Ethan to take it all. He'd meant it for me, too. The realization wasn't just pain, it was fuel. They'd betrayed not just me, but his legacy. My phone buzzed, a text from my mother. "Claire, stop this nonsense. You're tearing us apart." I stared at the screen, my lips curving into a cold smile. Tearing them apart? No. They'd done that themselves, years ago, when they chose Ethan over me, when they forged my name, when they burned my future to save his. I didn't reply. Instead, I called Susan, my voice steady. "File the request tomorrow," I said. "I want those records." She agreed, her tone sharp with purpose. Daniel's letter, Susan's plan, my grandfather's note, they were my arsenal, and I was ready to wield it. As I set the photograph down, I caught my reflection in the window. My eyes sharp, unyielding. They thought they could silence me, paint me as the fragile daughter who didn't belong. But Daniel's arrival, Susan's expertise, and my grandfather's hidden intent were turning the tide. I wasn't just fighting for my share, I was fighting for the truth, for the girl in that photograph who'd been promised a future. They'd underestimated me, and that was their fatal flaw. The bank records would come, and with them, the final pieces of their lie would fall. The bank on 3rd Street loomed like a fortress, its stone facade as cold as the secrets it held. I stood outside, the weight of my evidence, Margaret's diary, the ledger from the storage unit, the forged letter, the contract from Tom, pressing against my chest like a stone. Susan's request for the bank records, filed yesterday, was my next move, guided by Daniel's cryptic tip about my father's hidden accounts. My family's lies, the $200,000 stolen from my share, the forged signatures, the tarnished key, were a web I was unraveling, thread by thread. They thought they could keep me in the dark, but I was a librarian, trained to find the truth in the smallest details, and I was closing in. Inside, the air smelled of polished wood and stale coffee. Mrs. Ellis, a wiry woman with sharp eyes and a nameplate that read "Senior Teller," greeted me with a nod. Susan had warned me she was meticulous, a gatekeeper of the bank's records, but Daniel had called her a friend of Margaret's, someone who might help if I played my cards right. I introduced myself, my voice steady, and handed her Susan's request, a formal letter with the precision of a legal blade. "I'm looking into the Harper Family Trust," I said, watching her closely. Her fingers paused, just for a moment, before she adjusted her glasses. "I'll need to verify this," she said, but her tone held a flicker of recognition, as if my name carried weight. She led me to a small office, its walls lined with filing cabinets, and began pulling records. As she worked, she spoke softly, almost to herself. "Margaret used to talk about you. Said you were the sharp one." My heart skipped, but I kept my face neutral, my hands folded in my lap. The first shock came when she slid a thin folder across the desk, its edges worn but intact. Inside was a statement for an offshore account, opened 20 years ago in my father's name, with transfers totaling over $500,000, far more than the $200,000 I'd found in the ledger. The account was active, with recent withdrawals, and my name was listed as a beneficiary, but only in the original setup. A handwritten note, in Margaret's tight script, was clipped to the page: "Protect Claire's share. Richard's hiding it." My breath caught. Margaret hadn't just warned me, she'd left proof, hidden in plain sight, that my father had been siphoning my inheritance for decades. Mrs. Ellis watched me, her eyes sharp but kind. "Your aunt came to me before she left," she said. "She wanted me to keep this safe, said you'd come looking one day." The revelation was a jolt, not just of betrayal but of hope. Margaret hadn't abandoned me, she'd been fighting for me, even from the shadows. I thanked Mrs. Ellis, my voice calm, and tucked the folder into my bag. This wasn't just evidence, it was a weapon, one that could dismantle my father's empire of lies. But as I stood to leave, she stopped me, her hand light on my arm. "Be careful, Claire. Your family's been coming here for years. They're watching." The warning lingered, a reminder that my every move was under scrutiny. Back in my apartment, I spread the folder's contents on my desk, the offshore accounts. Numbers glaring like a confession. My phone buzzed, a text from Laura: "We need to talk, Claire. I'm on your side." The words were a lure, dressed in kindness, but I knew better. Her forged letter, her trembling hands at the family dinner, she was no ally. I didn't respond. But the text was a sign they were rattled, their perfect facade cracking under my pressure. I called Susan, my voice steady as I relayed the new evidence. "This account changes everything," she said, her tone sharp with purpose. "We can file a claim for fraud, but we need to move fast. They'll try to cover their tracks." I agreed, my mind already mapping the next steps, but a knock at my door stopped me cold. It was Ethan, his face drawn, his usual swagger gone. "You're going too far, Claire," he said, stepping inside uninvited. "This isn't just about you. You're hurting Mom and Dad." His voice was soft, almost pleading, but his eyes betrayed him, sharp, calculating, like a cornered animal. I stood my ground, my hands steady at my sides. "Hurting them?" I said, my tone ice cold. "You took my future, Ethan. You, Mom, Dad, Laura, all of you." He flinched, but then he pulled out a check, sliding it across my coffee table. "Take this," he said. $50,000. Walk away, and we'll call it even." The second shock hit. The amount matched the note under the baseboard, the one I'd found in their house. This wasn't a peace offering, it was a bribe, a desperate attempt to buy my silence. I didn't touch the check. Instead, I met his gaze, my voice low. "You think this fixes what you've done?" His jaw tightened, and for a moment, I saw the truth. He wasn't just complicit, he was scared, trapped in the same web my parents had spun. "You don't understand," he muttered, his voice breaking. "Dad's in deep. He'll lose everything if you keep digging." The admission was a crack in their armor, a confirmation that my father wasn't just the architect but the linchpin of their scheme. I leaned forward, my eyes locked on his. "Then tell me everything, Ethan. Or I'll find out myself." He left without another word, the check still on the table, a symbol of their desperation. The third shock came later that night, as I reviewed the folder again. Tucked inside was a second document, a trust amendment from my grandfather's era, signed by him and Margaret. It named me as the primary beneficiary of a separate fund, one my father had never mentioned. The fund was small, $100,000, but it was untouched, frozen in the offshore account. My grandfather's note from the photograph, "Protect her," wasn't just a sentiment, it was a legal directive, one my father had ignored. The realization burned, not with anger but with clarity. They hadn't just stolen from me, they'd betrayed my grandfather's will, rewriting his legacy to prop up Ethan's failures. I sat back, the folder open before me, my resolve hardening. Mrs. Ellis's evidence, Ethan's bribe, my grandfather's amendment, they were the final pieces I needed. My mother's texts, Laura's false offers, my father's silence, they were all part of a crumbling facade. I wasn't the fragile daughter they'd painted me as. I was the one who'd outlasted their lies, who'd turned their weapons against them. I called Susan, my voice steady. "File the claim tomorrow," I said. "I'm ready." As I hung up, I caught my reflection in the window, my eyes sharp, unyielding. They thought they could bury me, but I was the one unearthing their truth, and I was closer than ever to breaking their world apart. The courthouse steps were cold under my feet, the gray stone matching the weight in my chest as I prepared to face my family. My bag held the arsenal I'd built, Margaret's diary, the ledger from the storage unit, the offshore account statement from Mrs. Ellis, the forged letter, and my grandfather's amendment naming me as beneficiary. Susan's claim for fraud, filed yesterday, was a blade sharpened by weeks of careful planning. My family's lies, the $500,000 siphoned from my share, the forged signatures, Ethan's bribe, had been a noose around my neck for years, but today, I was cutting it loose. They thought they could silence me, but I was ready to tear their perfect world apart. Susan met me outside, her gray hair pulled tight, her eyes sharp with purpose. "They'll try to intimidate you," she warned, her voice low. "Stay calm. We've got them." I nodded, my face a mask of composure, though my pulse thrummed with the weight of what was coming. Inside, the courtroom was small, its wooden benches filled with a handful of locals, their whispers a reminder of the Harper family's pristine reputation in this Ohio town. My mother sat at the defendant's table, her posture rigid, her smile practiced but brittle. My father was beside her, his hands clasped, his face unreadable. Ethan and Laura were there too, his jaw tight, her eyes darting to the exit. The air was thick, not with warmth but with the tension of a family unraveling. The judge, a stern woman with silver hair, called the session to order. Susan presented our case, her voice steady as she laid out the evidence, the offshore account, the ledger's entries, the forged signatures, and my grandfather's amendment. I watched my family's faces as she spoke, catching every flicker of unease. My mother's smile faltered, her hands twisting a handkerchief. My father's eyes narrowed, a flicker of panic breaking his stoic mask. Ethan shifted, his fingers drumming the table, while Laura's face paled, her lips pressed into a thin line. They hadn't expected me to come this far, to turn their secrets into weapons. The first shock came when Susan called me to testify. I stood, my voice calm but deliberate, and recounted the years of manipulation, the vacuum cleaner, the house gifted to Ethan, the forged letter claiming I'd given up my share. I held up the offshore account statement, my eyes locking onto my father's. "This shows $500,000 taken from my trust to cover Ethan's debts," I said, my tone ice cold. My father signed it. My mother knew. The courtroom went silent, the weight of my words sinking in. My mother gasped, a performance for the crowd, but her eyes betrayed her, sharp, desperate, calculating. My father's silence was louder, his hands clenching until his knuckles whitened. Then came the second shock. Susan introduced a new piece of evidence, one I hadn't seen until this morning. It was a recorded conversation, obtained legally from Tom, the realtor, who'd worn a wire during a meeting with Ethan. In it, my brother's voice was clear, panicked. Dad moved the money offshore to keep it from Claire. Mom made sure no one asked questions. The room erupted in murmurs, the judge's gavel cutting through the noise. Ethan's face drained of color, his eyes darting to my parents, who sat frozen. Laura's hand flew to her mouth, but it was my mother's reaction that struck deepest. She stood, her voice trembling with false outrage. "This is a lie. Claire's twisting everything." But the recording was undeniable, a crack in their facade that no amount of charm could mend. I kept my gaze steady, my hands folded, letting their panic unfold. Susan pressed forward, presenting Margaret's diary, its pages marked with entries about my father's thefts, and my grandfather's amendment, which named me as the primary beneficiary of a separate fund. "They betrayed not just Claire," Susan said, her voice rising, "but her grandfather's will." The judge's eyes narrowed, her pen pausing over her notes. I caught a glimpse of Laura, her face crumpling, not with guilt but with fear. She whispered something to Ethan, who shook his head sharply. Their alliance was fracturing, and I was the one wielding the hammer. The third shock came from an unexpected source. As Susan concluded, my mother stood again, her voice softer now, almost pleading. "Claire, we only wanted to protect you," she said, tears welling in her eyes. "You were never strong enough for this." The words were a blade, dressed as love, meant to paint me as fragile, to sway the judge and the crowd. But I saw through her, saw the desperation in her trembling hands. I rose, my voice steady, cutting through her performance. "Protect me?" I said, my eyes locked on hers. "You stole my future to save Ethan's failures. You forged my name, lied to my face, and called it love." The courtroom was silent, the weight of my truth heavier than her tears. My mother sat, her facade shattered, her handkerchief twisted into a knot. As I stepped down, I caught my father's gaze, his silence no longer a shield but a confession. He'd orchestrated this, every step, from the offshore account to the forged signatures, and my mother had played her part, keeping their image pristine. Ethan's bribe, Laura's forgeries, they were all pieces of his plan, and now they were crumbling. The judge called a recess, her expression unreadable, but Susan squeezed my arm, her voice low. "You did it, Claire. They're cornered." I nodded, my face calm, but inside, my resolve burned brighter than ever. They'd thought they could break me, paint me as the weak link. But I was the one who'd turned their lies against them, and I wasn't done. Back in my apartment, I spread the evidence on my desk, the courtroom's echoes still ringing in my ears. My phone buzzed, a text from Daniel. "You were fierce. Today, Margaret would be proud." I smiled, a cold curve of my lips, and set the phone down. My mother's tears, Ethan's panic, Laura's crumbling mask, they were proof of my strength, not my weakness. The judge's ruling was pending, but I knew the truth was out, their perfect Harper family image shattered in front of the town. They'd underestimated me, and that was their downfall. One more step, one final move, and I'd reclaim what was mine, not just the money, but my dignity, my grandfather's legacy, and the future they'd tried to steal. The courtroom was quieter today, the air heavy with the weight of a verdict about to be delivered. I stood beside Susan, my hands steady, my evidence, Margaret's diary, the ledger, the offshore account statement, the forged letter, my grandfather's amendment, stacked neatly in her briefcase. The Harper family's lies, exposed in the last hearing, had left their perfect image in tatters. The $500,000 stolen from my share, the forged signatures, Ethan's bribe, my mother's false tears, they were all laid bare, and I was no longer the shadow they'd cast me as. I was Claire Harper, the woman who'd turned their deception into her strength, and today, I would reclaim what was mine. The judge's voice was firm as she read the ruling. The court finds sufficient evidence of fraud and forgery in the administration of the Harper Family Trust. Claire Harper is entitled to her full share, including the separate fund established by her grandfather, plus restitution for losses incurred. The numbers followed: $600,000, the total of my stolen inheritance, including the untouched fund my grandfather had set aside. The room was silent, the weight of justice settling over us like dust. My mother sat rigid, her face a mask of defeat, her handkerchief crumpled in her lap. My father's eyes were fixed on the table, his silence no longer a shield but a surrender. Ethan's jaw was tight, his hands clenched, while Laura's gaze darted to the door, as if she could escape the wreckage of their scheme. The first shock came when the judge continued. Furthermore, she said, the court orders an audit of all Harper family assets, including the business and properties, to ensure no further discrepancies. My heart steadied, but my mind raced. An audit would uncover every hidden account, every shady deal my father had orchestrated to prop up Ethan's failures. It wasn't just a victory for me, it was a death knell for their empire. Susan squeezed my arm, her voice low. This is bigger than we hoped, Claire. They're done. I nodded, my face calm, but inside, a cold satisfaction burned. They'd thought they could bury me, but I'd buried their lies instead. As we left the courtroom, the second shock hit. Laura approached me in the hallway, her eyes red, her voice trembling. Claire, I didn't mean for it to go this far, she said, her words spilling out like a confession. I only forged the letters because Ethan begged me. He said it was to save us. Her tears were real, but they weren't for me, they were for her own crumbling future. I looked at her, my voice steady, my gaze unyielding. You chose your side, Laura. You don't get to rewrite it now. She flinched, and in that moment, I saw the truth. She hadn't just been Ethan's accomplice, she'd acted for her own gain, hoping to secure her place in the Harper legacy. Her betrayal wasn't just against me, it was against Ethan, too. And now their alliance was dust. The third shock came later that day, in a quiet corner of the library where I worked. Daniel met me there, his weathered face softened by a rare smile. He handed me a small box, its wood worn but polished, engraved with my grandfather's initials. Inside was the tarnished key I'd seen at the family meeting, alongside a letter from him, written years before I was born. Claire, it read, this key opens a safe in the house on Maple Street. It holds your future, don't let them take it. My breath caught, not with pain but with clarity. The key wasn't just a relic, it was my grandfather's final gift, a safeguard he'd hidden for me, knowing my father's greed. I drove to the house, now Ethan's, and found the safe behind a painting in the study, its lock clicking open. With the key. Inside was a deed, not for the house, but for a small property in my name, a cabin my grandfather had bought for me, untouched by my family's schemes. That night, I sat in my apartment, the deed on my desk, the courtroom victory still fresh. My phone buzzed, texts from neighbors, whispers of the Harper family's fall spreading through town. I didn't read them. Instead, I walked to my window, the Ohio skyline soft in the dusk, and let my mind trace the path that had brought me here. The vacuum cleaner, a cruel jest, had been their first mistake, a symbol of their disdain that sparked my fight. Margaret's diary, Daniel's letter, Mrs. Ellis's records, Susan's strategy, they were my weapons, but it was my own resolve, cold and unyielding, that had carried me through. My mother's tears, my father's silence, Ethan's bribes, Laura's forgeries, they were all attempts to keep me small, but I'd grown larger than their lies. The truth I'd learned wasn't about money or property, it was about power. Families like mine wield it to control, to shape narratives, to bury those who don't fit their mold. But power isn't just in wealth or status, it's in seeing the truth and refusing to bend. For those of you who felt the sting of being cast aside, know this, your strength isn't in shouting back or breaking down. It's in the quiet work of gathering your proof, building your case, and standing firm when they expect you to crumble. You don't need their approval to claim your place, you need only your own will, sharp and steady, to carve it out. I was the daughter they called fragile, but I was the one who broke their world, not with anger, but with truth. If my story resonates with you, if you've ever fought to reclaim what's yours, join me. Subscribe to our channel for more tales of resilience and justice, where the underdog rises to rewrite the ending.